The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the city streets in a melancholy haze. Logan Carter sat behind the tinted windows of his sleek black limousine, his fingers absent-mindedly tightening around a crystal glass of whiskey. Outside, the world blurred into distorted lights, a perfect reflection of his own chaotic thoughts. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, he was supposed to be standing at the altar, waiting for Claire, the woman he had loved beyond reason. But instead, he was on his way to her wedding, where she would be marrying someone else. He should have declined the invitation. He should have ignored the cruel irony of it all. But pride and an insatiable desire to prove that he had moved on had pushed him into making a reckless decision. If Claire wanted to see him again, she wouldn't see a broken man. No, she would see someone who had already replaced her, someone stunning, elegant, desirable. But there was just one problem. There was no woman. Logan exhaled sharply, resting his forehead against the cool glass. He had dated after Claire, but no one had mattered. He had built his empire, drowned himself in wealth, yet the loneliness gnawed at him like an incurable disease. And then he saw her. Huddled beneath a flickering streetlight, a woman sat on the pavement, her frail body wrapped in a tattered blanket. Her hair clung to her face, soaked from the storm, and her arms trembled as she held on to a cardboard sign. I used to be someone too. Something inside Logan twisted painfully. He had never stopped for people like her, not because he didn't care, but because life had taught him that everyone had their own battles to fight. Yet tonight, as he stared at the woman, a crazy, reckless idea formed in his mind. He stepped out of the car, the cold rain seeping into his expensive suit, but he didn't care. As he approached, the woman shrank back, as if expecting him to yell or throw loose change at her feet. Instead, he crouched down and met her eyes. "Come with me," he said, his voice steady. The woman's brows furrowed in confusion. "What? I need a date, just for tonight." She let out a hollow laugh. "You're joking." Logan shook his head, pulling off his coat and draping it over her shoulders. "I'll get you a dress, a warm meal, and a place to stay. No strings attached." The woman studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes flickering with something unreadable. And then, as if deciding she had nothing left to lose, she nodded. "My name is Ivy," she murmured. Logan offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Tonight, Ivy, you're going to show my ex-fiancée exactly what she lost." Little did he know, this night would change his life forever. The ride to the boutique was silent, but the air between them hummed with unspoken tension. Ivy kept her arms wrapped around herself, her fingers gripping the fabric of Logan's expensive coat as if afraid it would be taken from her. She had learned long ago that kindness was often a trap, but something about this man intrigued her. He wasn't looking at her with pity, no condescension, no empty words of charity, just a quiet determination that unsettled her more than any cruel stare ever could. Logan tapped on the driver's screen. "Take us to DeLuca's." Ivy blinked. "Wait, DeLuca's? That's..." "The best designer in the city," Logan finished, watching her reaction. "If you're going to be my date tonight, you're going to look the part." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You do realize I'm homeless, right? I haven't stepped inside a luxury store since..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Since she lost everything. Since the world swallowed her whole and spat her out on the cold pavement." Logan leaned back against the seat, assessing her. "I don't care where you've been. For tonight, you're going to be someone they'll never forget." The boutique was nearly empty when they arrived, the kind of place that didn't cater to just anyone. The sales associate took one look at Ivy, her disheveled appearance, the way her hair clung to her skin in damp waves, and immediately turned to Logan, her professional smile faltering. "Sir, are you sure?" "Yes," Logan cut her off smoothly. "We need something for tonight, something breathtaking." The woman hesitated before nodding. "Of course, right this way." Ivy stood frozen at the entrance, her feet unwilling to cross the threshold. Logan noticed. He stepped beside her, lowering his voice. "What's wrong?" She swallowed hard. "I don't belong here." A flicker of something, understanding, crossed Logan's face, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he did something unexpected. He reached for her hand, warm and firm against her freezing fingers. "Tonight you do." Ivy wasn't sure why, but she believed him. For the next half hour, she was ushered into dressing rooms, her reflection staring back at her in a way she barely recognized. The ragged woman from the streets slowly disappeared beneath silk and lace, delicate fabrics brushing against her skin like a memory of something she once had. When she finally stepped out in a floor-length navy blue gown, Logan's expression changed. For the first time that night, he was speechless. Ivy shifted uncomfortably. "It's too much." Logan exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "It's perfect." She wasn't sure if he was talking about the dress or something else entirely. The drive to the wedding was even quieter. Ivy could feel Logan's tension now, the way his fingers curled slightly against his knee, the occasional glance out the window as if bracing himself for a storm. "Tell me about her," Ivy said suddenly. Logan's jaw tightened. "Claire?" Ivy nodded. He hesitated, then said, "She loved the idea of me." "Not me." Ivy frowned. "What does that mean?" Logan let out a short, humorless laugh. "It means she loved the man who could buy her a diamond necklace before breakfast. The man with the house in the hills, the invitations to the exclusive parties, the perfect future laid out on a silver platter." He turned his head slightly, his gaze unreadable. "But when I lost everything for a while, when my business nearly collapsed, when I needed her the most, she walked away." Ivy felt a pang of something unexpected. Sympathy? Number anger. Because she knew what it was like to be abandoned. "She called it bad timing," Logan added, his voice tinged with something bitter. "Now she's marrying someone more stable." Ivy studied him carefully. "And you want to show her what she gave up?" Logan met her gaze. "I want her to regret it." Ivy leaned back, crossing her arms. "And you think I can help with that?" A smirk ghosted his lips. "I think you're about to shock everyone in that room." Ivy wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next, but something told her. Neither was Logan. As the limousine pulled up to the grand entrance of the wedding venue, Ivy's heart pounded in her chest. The towering chandeliers visible through the vast glass windows, the elegant guests arriving in designer suits and shimmering gowns. It was a world she had been exiled from long ago. The world that had chewed her up and spit her out without a second glance. And now she was walking back into it, not as an outsider, but as Logan Carter's date. The driver opened the door, and Logan stepped out first, adjusting his cufflinks with the effortless confidence of a man who belonged here. Then he turned, offering Ivy his hand. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before placing her fingers in his. The moment she emerged, the air shifted. Conversation stuttered. Champagne flutes paused mid-sip. Eyes locked onto them, onto her. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. "Who is she? Is that Logan Carter's date? Where did she come from?" Logan acted as if he didn't hear them. He simply guided Ivy through the entrance, his grip firm yet reassuring. Ivy, on the other hand, felt the weight of every stare pressing into her skin, dissecting her, searching for cracks in the illusion. She swallowed hard. "I don't belong here." But then Logan leaned down, his voice low and smooth. "Hold your head up. You're stunning. Walk like you own the room." And just like that, she did. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of excess. Golden candlelight flickered against ivory walls, and a symphony played in the background as guests clinked their glasses. At the center of it all, standing on a raised platform beneath a canopy of white roses, was Claire. Ivy had seen beautiful women before, but Claire was the kind of beautiful that had been carefully polished to perfection. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves, her designer gown clung to her figure in a way that screamed exclusivity, and when her gaze landed on Logan, her smile faltered. Claire's fingers tightened around her new fiancé's arm as she whispered something in his ear. The man, tall, broad, and carrying the aura of old money, followed her gaze and narrowed his eyes at Logan. Logan smirked, the kind of smirk that held a silent challenge. He wasn't here to beg. He wasn't here to wallow. He was here to make sure Claire saw him. And then Claire's gaze flickered to Ivy. Ivy knew the look instantly. It was the look rich women gave when they were trying to assess the worth of something unfamiliar. Was she a model, a celebrity, or, God forbid, just some nobody Logan had pulled out of nowhere? The tension between them lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And then, with the grace of a queen, Claire's expression softened into polite curiosity. She stepped off the platform, making her way toward them. Ivy tensed, but Logan's grip on her waist tightened slightly, a silent reminder that she wasn't standing alone. "Logan," Claire greeted, her voice smooth as silk. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Logan smiled, cool and unreadable. "Wouldn't miss it." Claire's eyes flickered toward Ivy, and that was when she made her first mistake. Instead of acknowledging her like an equal, she dismissed her with a glance, a brief, almost imperceptible flick of the eyes before turning back to Logan. "So," Claire continued, tilting her head, "are you going to introduce me to your date?" Ivy felt the word like a slap, like Claire was testing to see if she even deserved a title. But before Logan could respond, Ivy stepped forward, extending a perfectly steady hand. "Ivy," she said, her voice smooth, unshaken. "Ivy Monroe." Something flickered in Claire's eyes. Surprise, maybe? Whatever it was, she masked it quickly. She took Ivy's hand for only a brief second before letting go. "Well," Claire said, her smile sharpening at the edges, "it's nice to meet you, Ivy." And then, just as Ivy had predicted, Claire turned her attention back to Logan. "You know, Logan," she mused, "it's funny. I never pegged you as the type to date." She trailed off, eyes flicking over Ivy in a way that made it clear she was choosing her words carefully. "Someone so different from your usual type." Ivy didn't blink. She had dealt with women like Claire before. Women who wrapped their insults in compliments and smiled while delivering a perfectly sharpened blade. But Logan didn't give Claire the reaction she expected. He didn't shift uncomfortably. He didn't look embarrassed. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, slipping an arm around Ivy's waist and pulling her in just a little closer. "You're right," he said, his tone amused. "She is different." He looked at Ivy then, his blue eyes glinting with something dangerous. "She's the first woman I've met in a long time who's real." Claire's smile froze. For the first time that night, Ivy saw something she hadn't expected. Claire was rattled, and Ivy couldn't help but wonder. Was Logan here to make Claire jealous? Or had this night just taken a turn that he hadn't seen coming? Claire's perfectly composed expression wavered for just a moment, but it was enough. Ivy saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the way her fingers tensed slightly at Logan's words. It was subtle, but to someone who had spent years surviving on instincts, it was obvious. Claire had expected Logan to show up alone. She had expected him to be bitter, maybe even regretful. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected her. Ivy felt Logan's arm rest lightly around her waist, his touch warm through the silk of her gown. He wasn't just playing a part anymore. He was making a statement, and from the way Claire's smile faltered, she had received the message loud and clear. "Well," Claire said, regaining her poise with practiced ease, "I'm glad to see you've moved on." The words were meant to sting, but Logan merely chuckled. "Moved on?" His tone was light, teasing even, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Claire, I barely remember what I was moving on from." The blow landed. Ivy saw it in the way Claire's posture stiffened, in the way her fiancé subtly shifted beside her. The tension was thick, palpable. Logan had won this round, but Ivy knew Claire wasn't the type to let something slip through her fingers so easily. "Well," Claire said, brushing a non-existent speck of dust from her gown, "I should get back. The ceremony starts soon." Her gaze flickered to Ivy, and for the first time, there was a real glint of curiosity in her eyes. Not just dismissal, something more calculating. "I hope you enjoy the evening, Ivy." Ivy smiled, every bit as poised as Claire. "Oh, I will." The confidence in her voice must have caught Claire off guard, because for a fraction of a second, something flashed across her face. Something that almost looked like concern. Then she turned, her fiancé placing a hand on the small of her back as they walked away. As soon as they were out of earshot, Ivy let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was intense." Logan smirked. "That was Claire. She's always been a master at the art of manipulation." He turned slightly, his eyes meeting Ivy's. But you handled her flawlessly. Ivy arched an eyebrow. Was that a test? Maybe, Logan admitted, a playful glint in his eye. And you passed. Ivy rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips. She had expected tonight to be humiliating, a spectacle at best. But somehow she wasn't just surviving this game, she was playing it. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, and Logan grabbed 2 glasses, offering one to her. To proving people wrong, he said, raising his glass. Ivy clinked hers against his, a small laugh escaping her. To making rich women uncomfortable. Logan chuckled, but there was something else in his gaze now, something deeper. And to second chances. She paused at that, something tightening in her chest. Second chances. If only life were that generous. Before she could respond, a chime rang through the hall, signaling the guests to take their seats. The wedding was about to begin. Logan exhaled sharply, his expression shifting. Ready? Ivy tilted her head. Are you? He hesitated. Then with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he offered her his arm again. And just like that, they walked toward the ceremony, unaware that the night was far from over. Because before it ended, secrets would unravel, hearts would break, and nothing would ever be the same again. The guests settled into their seats as the wedding ceremony began. Ivy and Logan took their place near the back, close enough to watch but far enough to stay unnoticed, at least for now. The soft melody of the string quartet filled the grand hall, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. It was the kind of wedding that belonged in glossy magazines, a celebration of wealth and status rather than love. Logan was stiff beside her, his jaw set, fingers curled slightly against his knee. Ivy studied him from the corner of her eye. He had been confident, almost amused before, but now, as Claire walked down the aisle, escorted by her father, something in him shifted. His hand, which had been resting on his lap, tightened into a fist. Ivy leaned slightly closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You okay? Logan didn't answer immediately. He just watched Claire, watched the way she smiled, the way her father beamed with pride, the way the world seemed to revolve around her. Then finally he exhaled. I thought this would feel different, he murmured, that I'd feel angry, or maybe nothing at all. His gaze darkened. But I feel something else. Ivy's chest tightened. What? Like I was nothing more than a stepping stone. His voice was quiet, almost dangerous. Like I was just part of her perfect plan until she found something better. Ivy glanced at Claire, standing at the altar beside her fiancé. She didn't look like a woman in love. She looked like a woman fulfilling a carefully crafted blueprint. You were, Ivy said softly, but that's not your fault. That's hers. Logan let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. And yet here I am, watching her say forever to someone else. Ivy hesitated, then reached under the table, resting her hand lightly on his. It was instinctive, a small gesture of comfort, but the moment her fingers brushed against his skin, Logan looked at her. Really looked at her. For a split second, something unreadable passed between them. Not just gratitude, not just companionship, but something deeper, something neither of them had expected. And then, do you, Claire Anderson, take Richard Montgomery to be your lawfully wedded husband? A heavy silence fell over the room. Claire's perfect lips parted, her hands delicately clutching Richard's. It should have been an easy yes, but she hesitated, Ivy's brows furrowed. Logan's entire body tensed beside her. Claire's breath hitched. Her fingers trembled slightly. And then, as if realizing she was faltering, she forced a bright smile. I do. A wave of applause erupted. The officiant continued, the ceremony moving forward. But Ivy couldn't shake the unease curling in her stomach. She wasn't the only one who had noticed. Logan leaned closer, his voice low. Did you see that? Ivy nodded. She hesitated. Logan's expression was unreadable. Why? Ivy swallowed hard. Maybe because she doesn't want this. The thought lingered between them as the ceremony wrapped up, as the newlyweds were announced, as the crowd rose to cheer for a love that, to Ivy, didn't seem real at all. And as Logan and Ivy followed the crowd into the grand ballroom for the reception, one thing became clear. This night wasn't over, not even close, because secrets were about to unravel, and what happened next would leave everyone in tears. The reception was a whirlwind of champagne toasts, forced laughter, and carefully curated perfection. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in a golden glow, and servers weaved through the guests with trays of hors d'oeuvres, too delicate to be called real food. Ivy watched from her seat beside Logan, taking it all in. The world of the rich, the polished, the untouchable. A world she had been locked out of for years, and yet she had never felt more present than she did now. Across the room, Claire stood beside her new husband, greeting well-wishers with a dazzling smile. But Ivy noticed something most people wouldn't: how her fingers twitched slightly, how her shoulders tensed every time someone mentioned the word forever. The hesitation at the altar hadn't been a fluke. Logan noticed it too. His jaw tightened every time he looked at Claire. He wasn't over her, Ivy realized. Not in the way he had hoped. He had come here for closure, for validation, for the satisfaction of proving to her that he had moved on. But something about Claire's unease was unsettling him. "She's not happy," Ivy said, studying Claire closely. Logan let out a dry laugh, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. She got exactly what she wanted: the money, the status, the picture-perfect life. But not you. His grip on the glass tightened for a fraction of a second before he exhaled, shaking his head. That was her choice. Ivy tilted her head. Was it? Before Logan could answer, a voice interrupted. "Well, well, Carter," a deep voice drawled. "Didn't expect to see you here." Both Ivy and Logan turned to find Richard Montgomery standing before them, Claire's new husband. He was tall, broad-shouldered, every inch the textbook definition of old money. His gaze flickered briefly to Ivy before settling on Logan with a smirk that held no warmth. Logan leaned back in his chair, lazy and composed. "Would have been rude to miss my ex's big day." Richard chuckled, slipping his hands into the pockets of his custom-tailored suit. "And you just had to bring a date." Logan's smirk didn't falter. "What can I say? I didn't want to make things awkward." Richard's gaze flicked to Ivy again, this time lingering a little longer. "And you are?" Ivy smiled sweetly, reaching for Logan's hand as she leaned in. "His." Logan went perfectly still. Richard raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering across his features before he turned back to Logan. "Guess you did move on." He leaned down slightly, voice dropping just enough for only Logan to hear. "But we both know you wouldn't be here if that were true." Logan's jaw clenched, but his smile remained intact. "Enjoy your wedding night, Richard." Richard chuckled, straightening. "Oh, I will." He cast Ivy one last glance before walking away, his presence leaving behind a tension neither of them could ignore. Ivy exhaled, gripping her champagne flute tighter. "Charming." Logan let out a low laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "He thinks he's won." Ivy studied him carefully. "Has he?" Logan didn't answer. Instead, his gaze found Claire again. And this time, Claire wasn't pretending. She was watching them. The moment their eyes met, Claire's mask slipped. Just for a second. Just long enough for Logan to see something raw, something unspoken. Regret. Then, as if realizing she had let too much show, she turned away. But it was too late. Logan had seen it, and for the first time all night, his confidence cracked. Ivy saw it happen in real time, the realization that Claire wasn't as sure about her decision as she pretended to be, that maybe she hadn't just let go of Logan, maybe she had lost him. The tension in the air was suffocating. Ivy wasn't sure where this night was headed anymore, but she knew one thing for certain. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, because somewhere in this ballroom, something was about to break, and when it did, there would be tears. The night continued, but the air inside the ballroom had shifted. The laughter felt thinner, the music duller, and Claire's mask of happiness was starting to crack in ways she hadn't intended. Logan sat beside Ivy, silent, his gaze flickering to Claire more often than he wanted to admit. But Ivy noticed something else. Claire was watching him too. Every stolen glance, every barely concealed flicker of emotion, it was all there, a story unfinished. Then came the moment that changed everything. The microphone screeched slightly as Claire's maid of honor, a woman named Madison, tapped it gently. The crowd hushed, turning their attention to the stage. "I'd like to propose a toast," Madison began, her voice sugary sweet, her smile all too knowing. "To Claire and Richard, the perfect couple, the power couple." The guests chuckled, raising their glasses. But Madison wasn't done. She turned her attention to Claire, eyes twinkling with something Ivy couldn't quite place. "You know," Madison continued, "I remember when Claire first told me she was getting married. She said Richard was everything she needed, stable, dependable, from a good family, someone who could give her the life she deserved." A murmur of polite approval rippled through the crowd. Richard smirked, raising his glass as if in agreement. But Claire, she froze. Madison wasn't finished. "And it made me think," she went on, pretending to ponder, "about how much Claire has always known what's best for her. Even when it meant making hard choices, even when it meant walking away from other things." The shift was almost imperceptible, but Ivy caught it. The way Claire's grip on her champagne flute tightened, the way Logan went completely still beside her. Madison knew exactly what she was doing. "But in the end," Madison concluded, lifting her glass higher, "Claire always lands exactly where she wants to be. So let's toast to that." There was applause, polite laughter, but Claire didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She barely moved at all. Logan's fingers drummed lightly against the table, his face unreadable. Ivy leaned in slightly. "She's unraveling." Logan didn't respond. He didn't have to, because the moment Claire's eyes lifted and found his across the room, it was written all over her face. She was realizing it too. The next moment was a blur. Claire stood abruptly, mumbling something to Richard before slipping away from the crowd. No one seemed to notice. No one except Logan. And before Ivy could stop him, he was pushing back his chair and following her. Ivy's heart twisted. She could feel it. Something was about to break. Something that had been held together by nothing but pride and pretense. And so, against her better judgment, she rose to her feet and followed. Claire was standing in the dimly lit garden outside the ballroom, her back to the door, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the stone railing. The night air was cool, but the fire in her chest burned too hot for her to feel it. "You shouldn't be here," she said without turning around. Logan stepped closer, his voice low, edged with something raw. "Neither should you." Claire let out a soft, bitter laugh. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Logan studied her, taking in the way her shoulders curled inward, the way her entire body seemed to be at war with itself. "You hesitated," he said finally. Claire stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Logan stepped beside her now, close enough to see the cracks forming in the perfect mask she had worn all night. "At the altar, when they asked you if you'd take him, you hesitated." Claire swallowed hard, her jaw tightening. It was a moment. It was doubt. She turned then, eyes flashing. "What do you want me to say, Logan? That I made a mistake? That I regret everything?" Logan didn't move. He just watched her, waiting. Claire let out a sharp breath, her voice breaking just slightly. "Because I can't." Logan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A flicker of understanding, a flicker of something neither of them wanted to name. "You can't?" he repeated, his voice quieter now. Claire exhaled shakily, shaking her head. "You don't get it. I had to do this. I had to make the right choice." Logan's jaw clenched. "And you think he's the right choice?" She didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. And just when the silence became unbearable, another voice cut through the night. "Logan." Ivy. She was standing at the entrance to the garden, watching them. And in that moment, Logan realized something. He wasn't the only one waiting for an answer. "Understood. I'll make sure to conclude the story within the next section while maintaining the emotional depth and impactful resolution. Here's the final section." The moment Ivy's voice sliced through the tension, Claire turned slightly, her gaze flickering to the woman standing in the doorway. For the first time that night, Ivy saw the truth in her eyes. Not just regret, but fear. Fear of what had already slipped away. Fear that she had chosen wrong. But this wasn't Claire's story anymore. It was Logan's. and his choice was standing right there, watching, waiting. Logan exhaled, shaking his head as if clearing the weight of the past from his mind. He looked at Claire, really looked at her, and for the first time since she left him, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel resentment. He felt nothing at all. "I used to think," Logan said slowly, "that if you ever regretted leaving, it would change something." He gave a small, humorless chuckle. "That maybe I'd want you back, that maybe it would mean something." Claire swallowed hard, her breathing uneven. "Logan," he shook his head, "but the truth is, it doesn't." Claire's lips parted slightly, as if she had something to say, but nothing came out. Because what was left to say? She had made her choice, and now so had he. Logan turned to Ivy. She stood there, silent, waiting, not demanding, not expecting, just there, and that was all he needed to know. He took a step toward her, then another, and then, without hesitation, he reached for her hand. Ivy's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his fingers, as if grounding him in the moment. For the first time in a long time, Logan felt free. He didn't look back at Claire. There was no need. Together, he and Ivy walked out of the garden, away from the past, away from regret. As they stepped into the night, Ivy let out a soft laugh. "So, does this mean I can stop pretending now?" Logan glanced at her, smirking. "Who said you were pretending?" Ivy's breath hitched, but before she could respond, Logan gently lifted her chin with his fingers. "I don't know what this is yet," he admitted, "but I do know one thing." Ivy arched an eyebrow. "What's that?" Logan's expression softened, sincerity cutting through the layers of charm and guardedness. "You're the only real thing that's happened to me in a long time." Ivy stared at him, stunned. Then slowly she smiled. And just like that, the night that started as a game ended with something neither of them saw coming. A second chance.